This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.
There is a lot going on between Washington and Jerusalem. Some of it sounds quite ominous. Israel, after 3 months of a legislation freeze, is going ahead with the judicial overhaul and protests to match. And we have Oscar winner Dame Helen Mirren on the show today. What more do we need to say? It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's Unholy, 2 Jews on the News from Keshet Podcasts. It is all going on this week. It has been fairly crazed. I know that the star quality is going to come later on with our interview with a genuine Hollywood movie stage legend. So that's where the sheer star power comes. But I did manage to bathe in a little bit of star power myself. And I'm still slightly buzzing from it because, as you already know, Yoni, I did see the legendary Bruce Springsteen perform here in London a few days ago, and it was just something else. I mean, transporting.
I am so unbelievably jealous. You know, I'm not usually jealous of you living in London and you're doing your Londoner thing because I love my city and I'm fine. But occasionally those moments where you're like, oh, just sort of off the cuff saying to me, yeah, I'm going off to Bruce Springsteen concert. Those moments are the moments I get, green-eyed jealousy.
I know. I don't blame you a bit because it was I did just sort of slip that reference in. So I wrote about the performance and about the whole experience, and I found it incredibly moving. I mean, it was brilliant, but also it was clearly a performance by a man who's now getting on a bit, and he acknowledged it and talked about time and all those sorts of things. Anyway, I checked in with our friend of the podcast, previous contributor, Eric Alterman, who is, among other things, a biographer of Bruce Springsteen, who directed me to a piece he wrote called Bruce Springsteen is Jewish. Subhead, he may be Catholic, but to many fans, including this one's, his lyrics speak to a different creed. You have to dig out the piece. It was in The Atlantic some time ago. It makes a very strong case that Bruce Springsteen is at least somewhere culturally
He's from New Jersey. I mean, that
people.
Gives him, some points for being Jewish.
Absolutely, it did and does. And, the name itself, people have often mistaken him for a Jew. Eric reports that the Jew or Not Jew website, how, by the way, did we not know about this, gives Springsteen a 6 out of 10 on its Jewish scale, even with its inevitable verdict, not a Jew. So we have to get into this. But no, do go and look at, you can look at the thing I wrote about Springsteen. It's there on the Guardian website, but also Eric's thing, Eric Alterman, Bruce Springsteen is Jewish. We're always open for debate on here. If you have a view on the Jewishness or otherwise of Bruce Springsteen, you know where to find us on various social media platforms. Let us know what you think. Anyway, that was my big cultural outing of the week.
And let me recommend your piece on The Guardian because it's beautiful. And you write about how he sort of embraces his age and doesn't try to, run away from it. I think it's a beautiful piece. But that was your events of your week. Let's talk about the events of mine. Somehow a little less harmonic and, I guess not mellifluous tones here in this part of the world. So where we are is that the Netanyahu government has decided after 3 months of freezing the legislation, we all remember the night of Netanyahu's decision to sack Yoav Gallant and the response of Israelis taking to the street, being very concerned about this, really probably a night of intense protests. The protests have been going on every week, of course, but that was a night in which Netanyahu decided to freeze the legislation for the good of the country and because of all of the external and internal pressure. But now after 3 months, Netanyahu is going ahead with it. And what we saw this week is the very first part of the reasonable clause and essentially scratching out the reasonable clause passed in the Knesset in first reading. And the coalition completely intends to go forward with this legislation to end it until the end of this session at the end of July.
Yeah, I mean, that is quite a timetable. Mm-hmm. And it means, just every day is going to count. It is only the first reading. There's a lot to do for them to get this through. But, I mean, to what extent should we be surprised by the fact that they are going ahead, despite everything, the protests, the international pressure? We're going to come on to some serious international pressure on that. The fact that they're, determined to steamroller this through, I mean, others did think they would not fully go ahead with it in its original form, and they haven't. They've dropped a whole lot of elements from it. But this is a core part of it, and it does, how do we account for the determination with which they're pursuing this?
Well, first of all, I mean, that is the salient question. If this does pass indeed in the second and third reading and become a law, and the coalition says it's going to do it within 10 days, right? The time frame doesn't allow for a lot more. It will be the first part of the judicial overhaul legislation to actually pass. And that is, of course, important. What this specifically means is that any civil servant in Israel will be dependent upon politicians and their ability to appoint or fire without any judicial oversight. Of course, the talk inside political circles is that the first thing they would want to do after that is to fire the attorney general, who's also head of prosecution and responsible for Netanyahu's trial. But you ask a good question, which is, what is the logic behind Netanyahu deciding to unfreeze the legislation? I think he is at this moment where he is more, let's say, wary of his own coalition and the forces inside it, more than anyone, Yariv Levin, who's the justice minister and the architect of all this. And that is the thing he's worried about. It's not that he's not worried about the United States, the pressure from the United States. We will discuss this in a moment. He's worried about, obviously, the reservists. And we said this is the main point. The pilots, the part of the Air Force, the reserve pilots who said they won't serve if the judicial overhaul passes. His gambit here, Netanyahu's gambit, is that on this clause, they will not actually live up to their threat, because what we saw to this point is just a threat. But he's saying, wait, for the reasonableness clause, now what? We're going to see tens or hundreds of pilots saying not actually coming to reserve duty. And I have a quote for you from something that is published on Friday in the Yediot Achronot newspaper. Amit Segal, our political correspondent, saying Netanyahu in closed doors is saying the country can do without a few squadrons, but it can't do without a government. And the meaning of us not passing this legislation now is that Israel won't have a government. You obviously argue the merits of what he's saying, but this is what he's thinking. He doesn't want to lose the government now, and in the near term, that's more important for him than what's happening later.
And that is an astonishing quote, given his self-styled image as Israel's Mr. Security, the idea of jeopardizing the security by saying, what's a couple of squadrons among friends, and then, but blatantly for his own political survival. I also think the tactic there that you've outlined is of sort of salami slicing. That yes, the pilots wouldn't swallow the whole package, but if you slice it and feed it to them slice by slice, then each individual slice is somehow palatable. And therefore, the reasonable course, just on its own, you're surely not going to refuse to serve just for that. He's testing that. And, there is further reporting, it's Amos Harel is reporting, that he's spoken to individual pilots, reservists, who are saying that they aren't, then because now the requirement is they can't move en bloc as a group. They have to individually take this stand. Yeah, that they'll take that stand. It's all going to be about numbers. Is critical mass possible? Will enough of these patriotic pilots say even the reasonableness clause is too much? And
also think about two things. One is that I did this interview this week with the former IDF chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, who's now in Benny Gantz's party, the National Unity Party. And he's saying security issues for Israel right now have never been so dire and complicated since the end of the Yom Kippur War. That's what he's saying. By the way, we will mention the Yom Kippur War also later in our program, in our conversation coming up. But listen to how dangerous he's saying. Look, all of the red lights are flashing. Our enemies think that our deterrence is low. We have a complicated security situation in the north and in the south, and this government does not have a bandwidth at all because it is dealing with the judicial overhaul. I make one more point of the difference between now and what we saw in March. The protests themselves definitely not dying down, but losing a little bit of the public support because Israelis are less and less tolerant of roads being blocked. They're less and less tolerant of the main airport, Ben Gurion Airport, being shut down. Actually, not shut down. The planes continued, but there are huge protests there. So Netanyahu reads that as well. And again, his gambit here is saying, I am passing this legislation by the end of the summer session, this part about the reasonableness clause, and then we'll see. Maybe he wants to kill it. Maybe he'll tell his coalition, that's it, we've done that, enough, let's move forward. But he wants to pass this in second and third reading to prove, at least to his home base, that he is, adamant about this.
And what some of the opponents say is the reasonable clause should not be misunderstood as only one part of a whole package. In a way, it's the whole ballgame, because under cover of that change, you could, runs the argument, do the whole thing, because you can appoint the people, you can say, well, this action that we want to do is legitimate and the court can't say it's unreasonable. And therefore you could smuggle through the rest of the package that was originally planned. So he's testing the country to its limits, I think. He's calling the bluff of the protesters. How far will you go? How much strength do you have? Will people come out for something which I can spin as just a small procedural thing? Mm-hmm. I mean, he's pushing it, whereas I think a few months ago, a lot of people thought he would not push things to the brink, that the threat of sort of Israeli self-destruction was so terrifying that he would not push things that far, and yet he is. So these are really fateful 2-3 weeks for the country. And, you hesitate to be hyperbolic about these things, but it feels like we're actually at crunch point now. And how it plays out over these, the next 3 weeks could be decisive.
Yes, and the feeling is really much of that. The tensions are very, very high, running high between both camps. There are the feeling of fumes in the air, of gas fumes in the air, and just a little bit of just one match can set this whole thing on fire. I really hope it doesn't. But yes, until the end of the Knesset session at the end of July, we are still going to be in that volume.
Just one thought that strikes me. For a long time, Israeli politics seemed to be that the main thing was external facing. The main thing was, for example, the conflict with the Palestinians, eruptions on the West Bank. And every now and again, there would be a domestic distraction from that. Now it's reversed. Those 48 hours that we talked about last week on the podcast, the battles and military operation in Jenin, that was a kind of 48-hour diversion, and then back to what really counts and what really gets the pulses racing, and that is the domestic clash. It now feels like that's the existential contest and question for Israel. And the other thing, outside, as it were, the borders, is a sort of, comes and then goes, so that Israelis can turn back to the conflict that matters, namely the one with each other and with themselves.
Yep. And when you think of the Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, former Attorney General, that I spoke to this week, and he's saying if this piece of legislation goes through, by the way, also the person who decided to indict Netanyahu, if this goes through, Israel will be a dictatorship, a threshold dictatorship. That is, who would have ever imagined that would be something we say? Yeah.
Well, it's being noticed around the world too. And that's what perhaps we should move on to that, because the relationship which, historically, from the beginning, and again, we might talk about this with our guests later on as well, is the one between Israel and the United States, the key strategic partner. And that relationship is under new and in some ways exceptional strain. There are a few signs of it, but one of them has come from a columnist who's been a guest on this podcast, of course, Tom Friedman of the New York Times, multiple Pulitzer Prize winner, hugely influential foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times. Important in this case, though, because of the sense in which he is extremely well connected to particularly democratic administrations. It's thought that he has the ear of Joe Biden, and that, if he's writing, then he's not only speaking for himself, as it were, that there is the implication that he is partly picking up what he hears from the administration. So what did he write in a column published this week? Headline: The US reassessment of Netanyahu's government has begun. In a column that really does not pull its punches, in which describes Benjamin Netanyahu as engaged in unprecedented radical behavior. It warns that this government, the Israeli government, is, quote, undermining our shared interests with Israel, our shared values, and he goes on to explain this, the vitally important shared fiction about the status of the West Bank that has kept peace hopes there just barely alive. He is saying that the tension between Washington and the government in Israel has reached such a pitch that essentially the United States will, before very long, reconsider its fundamental relationship with Israel. As I said, this isn't just, it is partly one of America's most influential journalists talking. There's also the sense between the lines that this is a message that has come from the White House that is being transmitted to Israel.
Yes, and we add to that, the president of the United States giving an interview to Fareed Zakaria a few days ago, talking about the fact that this government in Israel is one of the most extreme governments he's ever seen. He mentions Golda Meir. Since Golda Meir, he says, also the ambassador to Israel, the outgoing ambassador Tom Knights, to the Wall Street Journal. I think it's interesting he's giving that message to a conservative newspaper, and he's saying, we're trying to prevent Israel from going off the rails. This is a lot of talk that is worrying for Israelis and even worrying for Netanyahu voters. Now, officially what Israel is saying is we don't know of any reassessment that's going on. They also tried to sort of calm reporters in a off-the-record briefing saying, oh, yes, there have been all kinds of instances of reassessment. Actually, there was one official instance, and that is the example of its President Ford in 1975. But obviously, there were other instances of difficulties. Now, I will tell you, Jonathan, that the U.S. officials say to me, there's no reassessment. Our relationship is ongoing. There are challenges. But for example, security relations have never been stronger. Now, what is going on here? Obviously, there is an issue, right? I mean, we can't deny the fact that more than anything, this government sort of goes under everything that the Democratic Party, or not everything, but a lot of what the Democratic Party believes in. I mean, when you have Ben Gvir and Smotrich in a government, it's very hard to continue talking about shared values. And when you have a Democratic Party that is going more and more to the left, asking why, Israel is receiving such a hefty sum of military aid when some of them, continually don't, in a continuous way, don't agree with what Israel is doing. I think Tom Friedman mentioned in his column $146 billion till now Israel has received from the United States. I think he didn't even take into account inflation, so it's probably a little bit more than that. I mean, so these are really the issues. And, and at the same time, when you have Israeli ministers saying, well, Israel should, the United States should mind its own business, I don't think the United States sees it that way when it gives that amount of money. Now, I think it's important to say, to this point, nothing on the ground has actually happened. When you think of the fact that, for example, Reagan said to Begin, stop the war, and that's what stopped the first Lebanon war. When you think of Bush Jr., Bush 43, saying to Sharon, you get out of the Muqatta and don't hurt Arafat, and you do that in 48 hours, and that's what he did. When you think of the fact that Bush 41 told Shamir, listen, everything's fine in our relationship. We're just going to check in customs every part of the F-16 planes that are coming to you. And Shamir really got that. He really understood that means that he needs to come to the discussions in Madrid and to begin to discuss the Palestinian issue. All of these are things that are not remotely happening yet. What I'm trying to say is the United States has not yet really applied true pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu's government.
No, I think that's right. It can do more. Much more, and yet underpinning.
I'm not calling them to do it, by the way. I'm just mentioning the fact that they haven't.
And yet, despite everything you've said, it feels more severe this time because it isn't a disagreement about, in all three of those cases, a kind of military confrontation. It's saying the country itself, its direction, is becoming a country we don't recognize. Mm-hmm. That's different from saying we disapprove of this or that operation and we think you've now gone far enough. It's saying continue on the path you're on, and there's a parting of ways. No longer are there shared values between us. That is a more profound gulf than can be bridged simply by pulling out of an operation or cancelling a military move, and then it's all over in 24 hours. This seems to me deeper as a rift. I think, look, this is something that is not going to go away, and we will speak about it indeed with people very closely involved and watching it very closely in the next week or two. We should introduce our very special guest, who is indeed the star of a film that turns on some of the very themes we've just been discussing about Israel's relationship with the United States and moments when it becomes strained and fraught. She is a very special guest. Dame Helen Mirren is one of her generation's finest actors. She has won every prize possible in her field, on stage and on screen, obviously winning Academy Awards, and has played some of the most iconic women of recent history, including famously Queen Elizabeth II. She is in Israel as we speak to promote her new movie, where she plays none other than Golda Meir. Yonit, you're lucky. You're with her there in Jerusalem in person. Our guest for this week, Dame Helen Mirren.
Oscar winner, Dame Helen Mirren. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you today. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to begin with talking to you about this film. And obviously, Golda herself was such an icon in the 70s. I mean, she was the first female leader of a what we like to call ourselves a modern Western country. You know, can you tell us a little bit about what you knew about her then, and what you knew about her going into this film?
I didn't know a lot about Golda, but obviously I was very much alive and kicking and a young woman, you know, making my way in life in the 70s. And I do remember very clearly the excitement. I'm not too sure that that's the right word, but the feeling of triumph and of satisfaction and of awe, actually, that a woman had been elected to lead a country. Mm. I think it was the first time in my experience that I'd ever known that, let alone as a country as complex and iconic, if you like, if that's the right word, as Israel. So it was a very exciting moment for women in general, I would say.
Yeah. And your preparations are always legendary. Can you tell us a little bit about how you prepared? Because the Israeli actors were in awe of how you sort of prepared for this role.
Well, it's very nice of them to think that. I always think I'm extremely lazy. I put it off to the last minute always. But obviously with someone like Golda, you have a great advantage of a lot of film and sound, which is very, very important. And also, I think, because the whole thing of prosthetics has advanced so hugely in the last 10, 15 years, you know, you can do things with makeup now that you couldn't do like 20 years ago. So all of that was very advantageous for us. And then, you know, reading her book, that was very, very, very important. I don't know, just the little elements start coming together and then you sort of jump in off the deep end, really.
And what do you think this film adds to the understanding of Golda Meir? That I'm thinking particularly of the audience outside Israel. In Israel, it might be very different, but for the audience outside Israel, in other words, people, you know, like you, who have an outline, an inkling in their mind beforehand of Golda Meir, what do you think this film adds that people might not have grasped before?
Well, I think, first of all, Guy wanted to do the film because of the release of paperwork, which gave Israel a new understanding of what happened backstage, if you like, through the Yom Kippur War. And how, in fact, Golda was not as she took the responsibility onto her shoulders, but she was not ultimately truly responsible. She was not a commander. She listened to her commanders who were, you know, flush from their great success with the 6-day war and assuming that they would, you know, cruise through this one. And of course, it was absolutely not the case, but she trusted them to a certain extent, fought with them and trusted them, as we see through the film, and ultimately took the responsibility for the disaster, potential disaster of the Yom Kippur War. But I think for me, it was understanding the physical her physical suffering that she was going through, as well as the mental suffering of dealing with this enormous burden of the war, dealing with cancer treatments, the incredible pain in her swollen legs, the physical demands upon her that she was just gutting her way through. That was a revelation for me. I didn't know anything about that.
Because obviously in Israel, she's still a very controversial figure, and this is the sort of basic trauma of Israel's history, the Yom Kippur War, and a lot of people would blame her for not seeing the intelligence, for not preparing the military. So this movie really gives you a different view of her, and it's a much more forgiving view of Golda Meir.
Well, I think it is informed by the release of the papers that were kept secret for many, many years. And I think there is now a new understanding of really what Golda was dealing with.
And also there's this moment, which, by the way, is completely true. She said it in reality as well. She says, I'm not the one to make the military decisions. That's what the generals are for. And it's interesting because when you watch it as a viewer in 2023, it's a little jarring for you to hear the woman leader saying, I'm not making those kinds of decisions. But that's actually what she said in reality as well.
And I suspect that is a reality about war in general. You look at the horrific nature of the Ukraine war, for example, and Putin is a monster and a dictator, but he have to listen to his generals, as Churchill did. If a military commander says, I cannot do that, I do not have the men or the equipment to do that. It is not possible. You can't tell me to go there because I'm telling you it is impossible. You have to listen to your military commander. I would imagine that's a general rule of thumb.
Yeah.
The film doesn't labour this point at all, but there is more than one nod to the sexism she faced. There's this moment where she observes that the men, the ministers and military advisors do not rise for her. They don't stand for her. And she had a memory that they did for her male predecessors. And I wonder how much that bothered Golda Meir, or was she, and this is somebody I inevitably thought about watching the film, was she, like Margaret Thatcher, one of those women who you wouldn't really describe so much as a feminist as one of those women who thought they could be, as it were, and as Thatcher was called, you'll remember, the toughest man in the room?
I don't think Golda Meir and Margaret Thatcher had a huge amount in common. I don't sense that. I think Margaret Thatcher absolutely wanted to be where she was. And I don't think Golda did. I don't think it was her huge overriding ambition in life to become, the leader of Israel. It fell upon her for various historical reasons. And she just happened to be the only person in place when that role became open. And it kind of fell upon her. I don't think she wanted it. But she did have the capability of doing it, which is why, they asked her to take that role, because they knew she had the capability, and not everyone does have the capability. But I don't think she wanted to be Queen Bee, the way Margaret Thatcher did. And certainly she was very supportive of women, created women's schools, in the early creation of Israel. She was very pro-women, wanted to make sure that, women were educated and women took their equal place alongside men in this new country called Israel. So I see really great differences between the two of them. And I think likewise, Margaret Thatcher in the Argentinian War, I think she went into it thinking, here I go. It's my badge of honor. This is my Churchill moment. They're going to remember me for this. I'm going to be, I think she used it rather cynically, politically. I'm not sure. You know much more about this than I do, Jonathan. So, forgive me if I'm completely wrong. But, whereas Golda went into the Yom Kippur War in particular with incredible pain and a sense of the loss of life, and how every single boy who died in the Yom Kippur War was a scar on her heart, I think.
No, that reluctance and the heaviness of the burden is hugely part of your performance in this film. It really comes through, and you're, as opposed to Thatcher, who wanted to be kind of Gloriana.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I did wonder about this point about toughness and whether she did feel, and again, I think that you put this in the performance, of feeling the need to be as tough, if not even tougher, than most men. There are moments where she says they need to think I'm ruthless enough to kill tens of thousands or leave tens of thousands of men dead. And I just wondered if that was something she felt as a woman.
Yes, I do. Well, I don't know whether as a woman, but certainly as someone involved in a conflict, understanding that to show a moment of weakness can be the thing that the moment that the dam breaks and you are lost. So I think that within the terms of that war, she forced herself into, a rigid stance, because she knew that if the enemy sensed any weakness, they would be flooding through the cracks. And I can only imagine, I've never been in that position remotely, but I can only imagine, that's a fairly common thing within a war. You have to show an absolutely rigid wall of resistance
to survive.
I
yes. Think probably my favorite.
And the survival of Israel was at stake.
Right.
And the other thing that I never quite grasped until I did the film, that of course, Israel was still a very, very young country, and to lose, I can't remember the exact numbers of
2,600.
Yes, of boys, yes, was a huge percentage of the population of Israel. Right. It wasn't like, losing that number of people out of, 50 million. Right. You're losing that number of the beautiful young people of Israel, and a huge percentage of them.
And for a few days, you don't know if the country will survive.
Yeah, and not knowing the country will survive, exactly. So the pressures must have been so enormous. So no, you could not show weakness at that point.
There's this beautiful scene with Henry Kissinger,
yes,
in which he comes to talk to her about the terms of ceasefire.
And isn't Lev wonderful as Kissinger? He's
wonderful.
fantastic.
And he says there, you need to remember, Golda, that I'm reciting from memory, that I am an American, a Secretary of State, and then I'm a Jew. And you say, yes, but in Hebrew, we read from right to left, which is such a beautiful moment. And it really captures, I think, what the relationship between those two was actually about, specifically around those days of the war.
Yes, I know, absolutely. We can get into the deep, deep conversations of what it means to be Jewish, and where in your consciousness of who you are, where that sits,
But a lot of your roles seem to be of Jewish women. I mean, there's the debt.
I have, the debt, Woman in Gold, yes. Maria Altman. And in fact, I just did a film called White Bird. Yes, well, a lot of great roles. What can I say? I'm an actress. I love to play a great role.
Is that a coincidence, or it's just the great role and that's it? There's nothing about it that is, because there has been this discussion, and I have to say, in Israel, it is a complete non-issue. That issue of Jew
of Jewish people
can a
yes.
non-Jewish actor act in a Jewish role?
I love the fact that the whole concept of casting has completely been thrown up in the air, and the pieces are coming down in lots of different ways. And I think it's totally a discussion to be had. And it's opened up opportunities for people who were excluded, great actors who were excluded from acting because they were deaf. Think of Coda, handicapped. So it's opened up the world of acting to many people who were unfairly excluded. Mm-hmm. So I love that. I think that's great. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we don't want to limit Jewish actors to just playing Jewish roles, do we?
No.
And that might be an unfortunate, byproduct.
Right.
So it's a discussion to be had, definitely.
And do you think there's something about beyond the fact they're great roles, I just wonder if there's something that draws you particularly to these kinds of stories, to Jewish stories that do touch on these, nerves that we've talked about. I mean, the Golda story, but, a couple of stories, the Debt and Woman in Gold, that were Holocaust related. Do you think you have in some ways an affinity for this kind of narrative?
I don't think it's necessarily an affinity, but I do feel very, very passionately that we don't forget the Holocaust, that it doesn't slip into history. And we're on the cusp of that happening. And I was born at the end of the Second World War, and I grew up in post-war Britain. And the realization of what had happened in the Holocaust, which happened really fairly slowly over the next 5 or 6 years, and the very years that I was growing up. And my education about the Holocaust, which I guess happened to me when I was maybe 11, 12, 13, that sort of age, I think had a really, really profound effect on me. So I've just personally always felt that anything that we can do to remind people of what happened is really important. So whenever I've been asked to playing Maria Altman, for example, I felt that issue was incredibly important, of the artwork and the belongings that were stolen from Jewish families. And the whole issue of restitution, I felt very passionately about. So I really wanted to do Maria Altman for that reason. I felt the issue was very important. I believe in Israel. I believe in the existence of Israel, and I believe Israel has to go forward into the future and for the rest of eternity. Mm. So, and I believe in Israel because of the Holocaust, basically. So whether I'm within the film or outside of a film watching it, it is something that I do feel strongly about. Yeah.
Because the attitudes towards Israel have obviously changed since 1973. And today it's, sadly, I say, as an Israeli, much more controversial.
It's more controversial. It's more difficult.
And I wondered if there were anyone trying to say to you, don't do this film, don't come to Israel,
yes,
that kind of.
There were. And certainly people saying, don't go now, today, But having experienced Israel in the 70s and then subsequently coming to visit, I've met such extraordinary people in Israel that I know that there is a base, a foundation of deep intelligence, thoughtfulness, commitment, poetry even in Israel that is very, very special, I think.
You spoke against the cultural boycott, for example. You said that's a crazy idea.
I did. I don't, because I'd met great artists and in Israel, and to abandon those artists didn't seem right to me. On the contrary, work with the artists of Israel, the musicians, the actors, the wonderful actors that I was so lucky to work with on this film. They're members of I'm a member of their tribe. I might not be Israeli, but I am a member of the actors' tribe, It's the artistic community of course, I am an actor, so I believe in the artistic community, but it's the artistic community that I believe will carry Israel forward.
I'm interested in where the rest of your fellow members of the acting tribe, where they stand on this, because I would suspect some don't have the kind of sympathy or affinity for Israel that you've described. And I wonder whether your stance, your position has ever cost you. I mean, even parts or roles that might have come your way where directors on stage or screen or whatever have thought, no thanks, because she's sort of unsound on this issue. Do you think it's cost you at all?
Well, gosh, Jonathan, I wouldn't know, would I? Because, no one would ever tell me that. I really doubt it. I have to say, I really, really doubt it. I would be surprised if that was the case, I have to say.
And you've not fallen out with friends over it?
No, not at all. Absolutely not at all. I mean, it was funny, many years ago, I was at a sort of a rather slightly posh dinner party in New York. And there were a lot of liberal Jewish people there, wealthy liberal Jewish people. The subject of Israel came up, and the sort of early days of the conflicts that we are seeing now in Israel. And obviously the whole issue with the Palestinian people, which is so profound and tragic and difficult and painful, profoundly painful. So the discussion was opened up, and everyone sort of said their piece, and then they came down to me at the end, what's this English actress, what do you think about it? What's they saying in London about this? And I said, well, in 1967, I worked on a kibbutz. Have any of the rest of you ever worked on a kibbutz? So, of course, none of them had, all these big Jewish people. So I kind of, but, I honestly think it was that early experience that wrote the blueprint for my sort of feelings about Israel.
By the way, so did Jonathan. He was, you were in grapes, he was in bananas, but he was bananas, also spending,
yes.
There were kibbutz Ha'on, he was kibbutz Bet Ha'emek, same thing, same thing. But that you spoke about that, about having a Jewish boyfriend from the Royal Shakespeare Company. You both were there, and then you came to Israel, and you were here slightly after the
6-Day War, quite briefly after. I mean, about 6 months after the 6-Day War. Certainly there were no-go areas. Mm-hmm. I witnessed things that were wrong. I witnessed, Arabs being thrown out of their houses in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. I remember there was a general strike, an Arab strike, because, people were just being arbitrarily thrown out of their houses. And there was a lot of things that were to my mind, very wrong happening. But also, it was just the extraordinary sort of magical energy and of a country just beginning to put its roots in the ground. Mm-hmm. It was an amazing time to be here.
Obviously, this is also a very intense time to be here now with this judicial overhaul and the protests. And you had said, I think, to AFP that Golda would have disagreed with Netanyahu with what he's trying to do now. Can I ask about your views, what you think, what you're looking at when you look at what Israel's going through these days?
It's not just Israel, is it? It's Russia, it's Hungary, it's so many countries in the world. This sort of weird right-wing wave that's breaking upon the shore of the world. It's interesting the way things like this happen in different countries kind of at the same time. And whether it's some sort of visceral or some human reaction to the rise of liberalism that happened in the post-Second War era. I don't know, Jonathan, you probably know. You're much smarter than I am about these things. I mean, I don't know. But, it seems something that is not, it's not just happening in Israel. Let's put it that way.
No, I mean, hardly smarter, but I did wonder about whether the timing now, given this wave, I like the way you put it. I mean, the wave breaking on the shore, it is breaking on the shore in Israel. And I wondered if some people, not the crowd who would have demanded you boycott Israel at any time, but whether other people, maybe even quite pro-Israel people, but liberal people who don't like what's happening now, whether any of them said to you, look, Helen, now's not the time to go, because if you go, it will be seen as somehow support for this particular government.
People did say that to me. But I said, no, my people are the people out on demonstrating. And I know those people. And I know how remarkable they are. And how many there are of them. And that is Israel as well. It's not, it's not one-sided. So to me, it's more to, not that my existence here, I'm here to promote Golda. I'm not here as any kind of political, mouthpiece or anything at all. But if I was here at the weekend, I would join a group somewhere, find my group within the crowd, and I'd be there with them.
We are...
As many of my friends on this film are, incidentally. And Guy, our director, is there every weekend, yeah.
It's amazing because the Israeli actors with you and all the other people on set said the amazing thing about you is you have absolutely no celebrity attitude. They say she hung out with us. She was with us for hours before we came in, hours after. Like they're totally, they adore you. And they say it's something so sort of approachable and, not at all what they'd expect.
My tribe. They're my peeps. Yeah, my people.
So they felt it.
I'm just one of them, really. Yeah.
Just something general. We talked a lot about Israel and Jews and about Golda, but something about you. And there are so many actresses in Hollywood who say that they don't get opportunities after a certain age. You have seemed to miraculously circumvent this. I mean, you seem to not, this doesn't seem to be a problem for you. Can you tell us how? Or?
I think I've honestly been really, really lucky. Mm-hmm. It is so much to do with luck. I mean, the ability to play Golda, it's really wonderful. And yes, it's true. I mean, for men and for women. And there's a side of the entertainment industry that is to do with youth and energy. And so it should be. It's fantastic. Yeah. And indeed beauty and all the rest of it. And we all enjoy that and love it. And so it absolutely should be, I believe in the young. I think they're incredibly important. We need the young. And I think also women's stories were ignored or suppressed or dismissed. And I think I've been very fortunate in that I'm still alive through an era that is realizing the huge contribution that women have made historically in art, in science, in politics.
Could I just come in with a parochial British question? And that is that you obviously played the Queen on stage and you played her on film. And I wondered how the death of Queen Elizabeth touched you when it came.
I knew it was going to happen in my lifetime. And I knew it was going to be devastating when it came because I'm an Elizabethan. I was 7 when she was crowned. I think she's been there my whole life. And obviously a woman who had such a long life. She was absolutely, a brick in the wall of my Britishness. And that brick was gone. And and my wall, wobbled a bit. It was very, very profound, actually. I'm not a royalist particularly. I'm a bit of a Republican, really. So it wasn't that sort of thing, but it was, how can I put it? Really, it was my history, and she was very much not. No, I always said she was a bit like Big Ben. I drove past Big Ben 100 times without ever really looking at Big Ben and really understanding how Big Ben works. So it was a bit the same with the Queen. Until I did investigate her because I played her. It was profound, but we move on. Life has to move on, and Britain will become a different place. I think also, Jonathan, I don't know about you, but it's the loss of that generation to me as well. And I felt it when my parents died. A loss of the generation who experienced the Second World War, experienced in Britain in particular, post-Second World War Britain, the bombed out London, the 70s, the black, and the struggle, financial, economic struggle that Britain went through after the Second World War, the nobility of the creation of the socialist state that I very much benefited from, and all of that I call them, the noble generation, and the loss of that generation, I felt very strongly.
Dame Helen Mirren, thank you so much for talking to us. It was a pleasure. We could go on and on and on, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I slightly feel like you do after you've met royalty, I think. Remotely for me, you were there. I mean, did you not feel the urge to curtsy on some level?
A little bit. I wanted to even. It sets the bar quite high for future interviews on Unholy, don't you think? I mean, I think we can't do anything better than that.
No, she was wonderfully engaging and so interesting on Israel, her perspective on it, as somebody whose connection goes back, many decades, on Golda Meir herself. I just thought a really, really stimulating conversation with one of the most admired performers in the world.
And when you watch the movie, and we both watched it, right? She is Golda. Like, it took me, and I'm an Israeli, believe me, I know what Golda looks like. I mean, it took me very long minutes to try and remember what Golda actually looks like. I mean, the documentary footage comes at the end. You're like, oh, okay. Because I think for a whole generation of young people watching this film, Helen Mirren as Golda will be the image of Golda.
Yeah, no, completely. She inhabits that woman. We should do some award handing out, not Academy Awards, I'm afraid. We can't do those ourselves, but we have our own little nominations committee. And in fact, who've been meeting in conclave. You, Yonit, have been far too busy with breaking and developing news where you are. You have contracted out the nominations committee to me.
That
which
seems
has
to be
met,
happening a lot lately.
It does, because you've got quite a lot on your plate. But the committee met in almost constant session. We have decided that our Chutzpah Award, it breaks hearts always to hand this over to a print newspaper, but we are going to have to, I'm afraid, hand the Chutzpah Award a week to the Los Angeles Times sports section, because for cost-cutting reasons, and all newspaper journalists know about this, is having to cut its cloth and has therefore had to bring forward its deadlines. It now has to finish its sports section and print it earlier on in the day, indeed in the afternoon. And it means, therefore, that sports results that break in the evening games will now no longer be in the next morning's newspaper. Why is this chutzpah for our unholy audience? It's because that there is a whole culture which our Orthodox listeners, our Sabbath observant listeners will know well, which is when there is a Friday night sports game and it's impossible to check TV or use a phone because people don't do that on Shabbat, the only way of finding out the result is to look in the print newspaper the next morning. And there was a lovely piece in the forward by Lewis Keane, who says that he grew up with that tradition of there'll be a Lakers game the night before, and then as part of his Shabbat ritual, Friday nights thinking about the game, were they going to be up, were they going to be down, and then finding the outcome in the print newspaper that morning, which you could, of course, read without violating the Sabbath. That is no longer happening. A ritual, a Jewish rite for the Sabbath observant sports fan has been removed by this decision. We understand why it happens, because print is not as easy as it was. But I'm afraid a Chutzpah Award goes to the LA Times for depriving the Orthodox sports fan of that very particular pleasure. So I'm afraid that award on its way to Los Angeles. Meanwhile, our Mensch Award goes to the European Union of Jewish Students, who have taken Twitter to court. They've done it in Germany, where these kind of lawsuits are it's a more hospitable environment for these kind of lawsuits. A German court has ruled so far in favor of the European Union of Jewish Students to say that they can bring an action accusing Twitter of allowing hateful content to proliferate on its platform. It's another headache for Elon Musk, but EUJS, alongside the German digital advocacy group Hate Aid, had gone to the courts to say this is there was insufficient moderation of content, anti-Semitism and hate speech was getting through. They picked out a few specific tweets, and the German court has said yes to them. I think social media and hate speech on all social media is a huge problem. Often people throw up their hands in feeling powerless to do anything about it. But Jewish students have set a lead and said, no, you can fight back in the courts. The German courts have said yes to at least this initial first judgment. And so a Mensch Award on its way to them.
Very good. See, you don't need me at all. You could do this all by yourself. Could be
the
one
committee has
Jew
actually
on
let
the
me
news.
know.
It's just not a rhyme. That's a problem.
It doesn't work as a rhyme, and the committee has let it be known that they will refuse to serve unless the full complement, the full minyan of the committee is restored, and we are quorate again next time. So don't make a habit of it, Yonit, but we are giving you special regal dispensation in a week where we had Dame Helen Mirren has been granted. So yeah, Chutzpah and Mensch on its way, those awards on their way. We should say that if you have responses to any of what we've been talking about, including the question raised by Eric Altman, is Bruce Springsteen Jewish? Go to @UnholyPodcasts on Facebook and on Instagram. Let us know what you think.
And we will say our thank yous to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat, Rom Atik. And we will meet next week, Jonathan.
See you then.
See you.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.